Hello, everyone, and happy World Town Planning Day. My name is Filip Czafol-Silenko, and I'm committee member of the RTPI Yorkshire, and I'm also chair of our international group at the RTPI Yorkshire. Just before we begin, a few housekeeping points to help you to get the most out of this session. This webinar will last for 90 minutes and will be recorded. After this session, you will all receive a link to rewatch the webinar and to be asked to complete a survey. Each of our speakers will give a brief talk regarding effects of urban heat. This will be followed by a question and answer session. Please post your questions in the Q&A box at any time throughout the presentations. The Q&A box is on the right-hand side of your screen, where you also can vote on questions. We will collect all questions and we will do our best to get through to as many as possible. If you would like closed captions, please press the CC button at the top of your screen and you can choose your CC language there. Please note, as attendees, you have all been muted by the organizer. If you lose connection to the session, then please refresh your browser or try to rejoining via your link. Now back to World Town Planning Day, which is, as some of you might know, celebrated annually on the 8th of November. On World Town Planning Day, we celebrate how good planning improves lives of people and benefits society at large, creating vibrant places to live, work, and play together. This year's World Town Planning Day's theme is With Planning We Can, and the RTPI is pleased to join the global community and celebrate the positive impacts of planning. The RTPI contributes to World Town Planning Day by several activities, including a series of webinars. Today's webinar is part of this series and focuses on the challenges of urban heat, understanding, adaptation, and resilience. In today's event, we will explore how the effects of urban heat islands on cities and regions can be managed through strategies, policies, and adaptations. To do so, we have some excellent speakers lined up covering the Global South, the Middle East, the US, and the UK. To keep my introduction short, I will just briefly introduce the first speaker, and once they have given their presentation, I will introduce the next. So our first speaker today is Dr. Stephanie Piper. She works at the intersection of ecology and community resilience, aiming to provide benefits and protection from climate change to all communities. Her research interests include urban ecology, reforestation, extreme heat, and applying science to improve and protect the environment. Before joining American Forests, Dr. Piper was a researcher at Houston Advanced Research Center. And now I'll hand over to you, Stephanie. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and excited to be here today. Good morning from my side. Good afternoon where many of you are. I'm going to be talking about heat mapping and mitigation efforts happening in the Houston, Texas area where I'm based. My degree is in botany, so it's going to be very tree heavy, but it all counts with planning. And so we'll start by just introducing American Forests for those of you who are not familiar with our work. We're actually the first national nonprofit conservation organization in the US. We're celebrating our 150th birthday this year. And forests is our main goal, healthy and resilient forests, but a lot of that comes from place-based partnerships, working with people, and again, building those movements with communities to protect people. And one of the things we're protecting people from, of course, is urban heat. So I want to give kind of a primer to some of the extreme heat issues in America. As I'm sure everyone is aware, we're at a very, let's say, dynamic time politically in America. And what happens is we have a lot of differences in federal, state, and local level policy and what can be done. A lot of government web pages and databases were taken down and stood up privately, things like economic and climate justice screening tools. But there's also some very interesting history of development and planning across, the larger country. And I'll talk about Houston specifically shortly. One of the things that's, of course, major in America and in Houston, it's very car-focused infrastructure. So it's very heavily developed, a lot of impervious surfaces that certainly contributes to heat. We also have huge amounts of land, places like Europe, where there was more limited land when developing, a lot of development had to be very intentional. That was not the case in the US. And you can tell by the way cities are laid out. Houston is a great example of that. The other thing that is very true in America, and certainly other places as well, is that we have this phenomenon called the luxury effect, where green spaces are really concentrated in richer, higher socioeconomic areas. And so what happens is these underserved areas face a lot of that limited cooling with high heat. And so that's just kind of the landscape that we're broadly in. But to talk about the urban heat island effect broadly, so most of us are likely familiar with this, the idea that essentially we have this urban core that is high heat compared to the rural outliers. We often visualize that kind of like a bell curve where it's super high and then it moves out. A lot of that is due to impervious surfaces, development, transportation infrastructure, as well as limited cooling interventions because it's so heavily developed. But what's interesting in most cases is we don't actually have that even spread from high heat to cool, right, in the rural areas. We do have industrial areas, suburban areas, parks that really alter kind of what exactly that heat island curve looks like. And that's particularly true in Houston. Like I said, not super intentional development. So it's very sprawling and the land cover is very heterogeneous. It's also the largest city in the US with no zoning regulations. You can build anything anywhere in Houston, which certainly contributes to this very choppy urban heat island. So to think about Houston's specific heat challenges, Houston is known for very hot, humid summers. In 2023, we had over 39 days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 38 Celsius, with 18 consecutive days over that temperature. So we have really high incidence of heat and very long stretches of it. Now this summer was actually quite mild, but what happens in Houston a lot of the time is that means there's a much longer tail. So actually the daily high didn't drop below 85 degrees Fahrenheit, 29 Celsius until the final weeks of October. And it's actually going to go back up there in the next couple of days. There's also this interesting fact of Houston that a lot of the city development doesn't actually center heat mitigation. It's really about staying out of heat. Some of that is, high use of air conditioning. But something I didn't know about Houston until I lived here is in the downtown area, there's actually a tunnel system. So it's cooler in the tunnels. You don't have to walk on the streets. So instead of mitigating heat, we're just completely avoiding it. And so you'll go downtown in the middle of the day and no one will be on the street, which is a very odd thing to see. We also have a very interesting energy landscape here in Houston, which certainly affects how people are interacting with heat because everyone in Houston will have air conditioning, or almost everyone. And in Texas cities, power companies actually have monopolies. So we have one electric company that powers the whole city. What happens then is when there's power outages or power access issues, it can be quite devastating. Just last summer, we had Hurricane Beryl, which was a Category 1 hurricane. That's the lowest category you can get. But because there was a lot of wind, limited maintenance on trees and limited maintenance on the electric system from the company that has the monopoly, it was a very devastating loss of power in the middle of July. So a very hot time. I personally was out of power 5 days. That was not something I would recommend to anyone in Houston. And so what this all comes to mean is that heat-related illness and deaths are really major risks in Houston. So between 2019 and 2023, there were just over 7,600 heat-related illness encounters and 80 deaths. And you'll see on these graphs for heat-related illness encounters and deaths, that yellow line, that's that peak, that's in 2023. That's that year we had those really long stretches of over 100-degree days. And extreme heat actually kills more Americans than any other weather event. In actually Phoenix, Arizona, I just learned that extreme heat kills more people than homicide in their city. But it's important to remember that not everyone's risk is the same. And in a place like Houston, where the land cover is very heterogeneous, that development and how the city is laid out plays a role in that. This picture is from my local newspaper. This woman is in a neighborhood called Gulfton, where it is very heavily developed, all multifamily housing, very limited trees. And folks that live in this neighborhood, will walk to bus stops for 20 minutes in the sun, and people are used to getting heat stroke once a year. And so not only is that a quality of life issue in this one hot neighborhood, but it's also a question of life and death. People are putting themselves at risk in a way that not everyone in the city has to. And so that brings us to this heat mapping approach. And why should we map and model urban heat? We know heat's an issue. We know it's hot in Houston. What's the point of proving that? But really, the first step to mitigating heat is understanding the patterns of risk and the hotspots that exist. So where we need to do that mitigation. In the short term, that helps officials manage extreme heat days, setting up cooling centers, making sure people have access to the things they need. But it also helps guide mitigation and adaptation planning and inform urban greening strategies so we actually can mitigate in the right places in the right way. And in the long term, we want that to create cooler cities by limiting extreme heat while also protecting public health and the communities in the city. And so I wanted to share this Houston heat model. This is from my previous organization, part of this group called the Houston Harris Heat Action Team. I definitely recommend you check out their site. It has this afternoon model as well as a number of different ways to engage with the data, and that data is open access as well. But just some high-level points to kind of get a sense of what Houston looked like. This was a single-day heat campaign mapping in 2024, so it is just a snapshot of the time, but it provides us a way to understand where those hotspots might be. And so the maximum temperature we saw was 103 degrees Fahrenheit, about 39 Celsius. That's a pretty standard middle of summer temperature. But what I think is more interesting is differences between the neighborhoods were up to 14 degrees Celsius or 14 degrees Fahrenheit, 8 degrees Celsius. So depending on where you are in the city, you're having a very different experience with heat. Hotspots that stand out, those really red areas, are often those heavily developed areas, the ones with limited green space. And a lot of those are in neighborhoods with vulnerable populations who are already at risk of heat and being, further stressed. This model is the afternoon heat, but we also measured in the morning and evening. And so it's important to note that a lot of these hotspots had also very high morning heat and really limited cooling overnight. So it not only puts these people at risk, but they have very limited chance to recover from the heat before another hot day begins. And it doesn't cool down incredibly heavily overnight in Houston either, part of the effects of that humidity. And so let's talk about solutions. So we can think about a lot of different solutions that can be implemented. I'm going to spend the rest of the talk mostly talking about reforestation, green space, and trees. I'm a botanist by training. I work in a forestry group, but it's important to note that there's a lot of different solutions we can use, and different needs need to be met, different timelines. So things like sustainable and resilient design, really building our cities in a way that prioritizes keeping people safe and cool. There's also energy access and equity. In Houston, we have a lot of need for air conditioning and people who will ration their air conditioning because they can't afford to pay the bill. And that puts people at this higher risk that they don't need to be at, as well as local ordinances and development. Like I said, the federal government system is a bit of a mess and often is in different ways. And so a lot of those green space needs and development choices happen at that local level with local ordinances as people are developing and redeveloping land. But again, I'll talk mostly about green space, but it's important to know that when we're relying on trees, it takes a while for them to grow to maturity and provide those services. So it's important to remember that other solutions may be better in certain cases. It really depends on what people need. And we also have to consider how making trees work can be done in the right way. And so trees are a very valuable tool for heat mitigation, as well as a number of other benefits, things like improving air quality, preventing flooding. You can see in these maps, that red area is right next to an interstate, whereas as it cools down kind of in those green spaces or along those bayou corridors. And so we see that there is a huge benefit of having those tree areas compared to that heavy development just for heat. And so how we use trees as mitigation, we know they can work, but we also need to consider both access to those trees and tree equity, as well as stewardship and being sure those trees can succeed. And so I want to briefly talk about the tree equity score. This is an American Forest tool. This is just to the US, but it's very interesting. And I recommend, exploring this. But essentially, it's highlighting where there's inequitable access to trees. It measures how well the neighborhood provides the benefits of tree canopy, particularly to those at risk. And there's a huge number of neighborhoods and towns that you can look at this. It's a great way to kind of understand what the canopy equity looks like and access to cooling. And for those of you curious about the math behind this and how this score is calculated, it looks at both tree canopy needs, so what the tree canopy goal is based on targets and building density, minus the existing canopy, so what canopy is already there, and then we multiply that by the priority. And so these are a lot of social factors that really need trees, need cooling. in some way. And so here's a shot from Houston. You'll see kind of that diagonal line right across there. That is one of the interstates in Houston. You'll see where it's orange, there's less trees. By and large, Houston, because it's a humid city, has much more canopy than a lot of drier areas, but there's still this, disconnect in where the best canopy is, where the most canopy is. And if you use the tool, you can see kind of what is contributing to that score. Just an interesting way to remember that even if we plant trees, we need to plant them in the right places, especially people who are at risk and really need them. But the other piece of tree planting as a solution is that stewardship and maintenance. I love to use this modified quote from an Emily Dickinson poem where she says, to be a flower is profound responsibility. I like to say to be a tree is profound responsibility. When we plant a tree, the tree doesn't know that it's there for ecosystem services or heat relief. It's just going to grow as best as it can. And so we have to make sure that they establish providing water, but also make sure that they are safe. Like I mentioned, this is a picture from Hurricane Beryl, where the energy company did not maintain a lot of the trees. And so what happened is in high winds, so many trees fell on energy infrastructure, and that led to this wide blackout and really kind of sparked some anti-tree sentiment in the Houston area. And so it's important to remember that as we use these as benefits, we need to be aware of mitigating those disservices and giving them the best chance to provide the benefits we expect them to provide. And so in sum, just to get kind of the main take-home messages out, both heat risk and access to mitigation solutions are not distributed equitably. So we need to be able to improve that so people can actually protect themselves from heat. Extreme heat is a major issue. It needs attention, but especially in the support of community resilience and making sure people are able to keep themselves safe from heat and get the benefits and solutions they need. And there are multiple solutions to address extreme heat. Like I said, we need to implement trees mindfully, and we need to understand when trees might not be the best choice or might not be wanted in the community, and think about how we can kind of build a mosaic of solutions in cities to address heat. Because trees are not the silver bullet, we'll need the right tree in the right place, as well as stewardship to maintain those ecosystem services. And so with that, happy to take questions now if we save questions to the end, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. That was really a very insightful talk, and also gives us, I think, a good start to our wider conversation afterwards, after we have had all speakers giving their talks. I think what it really shows is a good insight of how problematic the situation is, not only in Houston, but I think then what also other speakers show in other areas on regions on our globe. And trees, I think we will come to that even more so, can be really a part of that solution, I think. And I want just to introduce briefly now our second speaker, which is Polly Turton. She is an environmental planning and design consultant specializing in how changes in the built and the natural environment, including climate change, impact health, and resilience, can be achieved. As head of climate action and public health at Love Design Studio in Shade, the UK, she brings over 20 years of interdisciplinary experience across planning, infrastructure, and urban design. She also serves on advisory and expert panels focused on healthy planning and housing in London. And now head over to you, Polly. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, Stephanie. So yeah, I'm going to give you the sort of UK perspective, and more specifically the Shade the UK perspective on the challenges of urban heat. But first of all, a bit about who we are. Shade the UK are a community interest company working collaboratively to adapt the UK's built environment and public spaces to protect vulnerable people against a changing climate, with a particular focus on heat. And the reason why we exist is because it's getting hot in the UK. We are not the hottest country in the world, but we have a very real problem, which is that when it gets hot, the health and well-being of vulnerable people is being unnecessarily affected. And in the most extreme cases, we are also experiencing those excess heat-related deaths, as Stephanie referred to. But the good news is we have a plan on how we want to solve it. And that's around raising awareness and knowledge of the issue of heat risk in the UK, working with others to find means and funds to deliver practical projects, heat adaptation projects on the ground, and working to influence policy and practice more widely. And our overall goal is 0 deaths from overheating in the UK, which sounds a bit dramatic, but it's our job description. And the reason why we are focusing on that 0 deaths figure is during the 2022 heat waves that we had in the UK, there were over 3,000 excess deaths relating to the heat. And if we don't do anything about that, there will be more like 7,000 excess deaths during a hot summer in the 2050s. But if you look globally, that number is much, much bigger. Almost 500,000 people die every year from the heat currently. And by the 2050s, that number is set to increase by 5. So, the UK in some ways pales into insignificance, but every person affected by the heat, has a story to tell and deserves, solutions to heat risk. And when we talk about, the sort of heat risks to people's health, the people we are most concerned about are those who have underlying vulnerabilities to heat. And this diagram here just shows you some of these groups of people, ranging from the very old, the very young, people with pre-existing health conditions that can be exacerbated by hot weather, pregnant people and their young children, and people with physical or mental disabilities. And for various reasons, these people are disproportionately impacted by heat. But anyone can be impacted by heat. And this additional kind of pool of people are often, healthy young adults, going about their business, day-to-day activities, but when exposed to heat for prolonged periods of time, become vulnerable to heat. So, for example, if you are in a queue with no shade, for example, or you're at a festival having a great time, but there's nowhere to cool down, you can become vulnerable to heat. So we need to think about everybody when we're looking at heat solutions. And this diagram here just shows what we are aiming for, which is everyone being heat healthy and avoiding the kind of 3 sort of tiers of heat injury, ranging from stress, exhaustion to heat stroke. So some of our work to address this in practical ways is covered on the next few slides. We are particularly proud of our 40 Degree Stories project, which gets its name from the 40 degrees Celsius temperatures that were reached in the UK during summer 2022. We went to interview people in different communities in Islington, a borough in London, and we captured their stories, their portraits, and we turned it into a project. The ones most relevant to sort of spatial planners and town planners, I'll just highlight a couple. So this is Cornelius, who is a healthy older adult, but he's very aware of not taking on too much water during the hot weather, which would be very good for him in terms of keeping him hydrated. But he's worried about there not being enough toilets in his local neighbourhood. So this can prevent older people being active, being sociable, and staying hydrated during the hot weather. Another spatial planning related one is Maura. So she is lucky enough to live on the ground floor and have a back garden, but she just doesn't think there is enough greenery around her flat and on her estate. So these stories kind of capture these insights and these lived experiences of the hot weather in a very kind of personal and place-based way. And this is informing our ongoing work. Another piece of practical work we've produced is in collaboration with the British Red Cross, who were at the forefront of the humanitarian response to those heat waves during 2022. People were asking them, what can I do to make my home more resilient to these high temperatures? And we came up with this guide, which is aimed for anyone who lives in a home. It could be a flat, a house. They could own it. They could rent it. They could have £5 or £5,000. And the idea is just giving people inspiration and advice about what they can do to cool their homes. I've picked 3 of the 5 categories most relevant to the planning and built environment world. So external shade is the single most effective thing you can add to a home to keep it cool. This stops the sun reaching the indoor spaces to start with. Passive cooling, keeping the surfaces around your home cool is the next most effective thing you can do. And then ventilation. So not all of these have a kind of planning link, but for example, windows that can be easily opened and closed in a secure way would fall into the remit of planners. Sort of zooming out a little bit from the home to the neighbourhood, we completed a piece of work for Camden Council this year called the Home and Livable Neighbourhood Heat Resilience Study. This is a neighbourhood in central London which had previously been identified as a high heat risk neighbourhood based on the Greater London Authority's climate risk maps. What we did was then produce a number of outputs to help Camden understand heat exposure, heat vulnerability, what they could do about it, and put it all in a strategy for heat resilience, part of a shade and cooling master plan. And we came up with a hierarchy of thermal comfort design principles for outdoor spaces, which I'll talk you through. So the heat exposure analysis, a bit like Stephanie's heat model for Houston, we zoomed in to the neighbourhood level this time using a metric called the Universal Thermal Comfort Index, which some of you may be familiar with. And this is sometimes known as the feels like temperature. So it combines a few other variables, not just air temperature. And this map shows the dark purple areas are the least comfortable parts of the public realm, and the lighter colours are the more comfortable parts of the public realm. We then looked at the assets and features in the area that are what we thought were sensitive assets and could then potentially become vulnerable to heat when exposed. We then, overlaid that and came up with a hotspots long list. So these are hotspots based on heat exposure and underlying sort of vulnerability factors. And the main factors for heat exposure related vulnerability are, the shape of the buildings and the layout of the buildings, the built form, the orientation of those buildings, whether they're south or southwest facing, and what the albedo values are of the surface material. So whether they're dark, grey, asphalt, human-made, or whether they're lighter coloured or green or blue, sort of parks and water bodies. And one of the hotspots was a housing estate. And we looked at a kind of before and after, a kind of now and in the future, and kind of worked out the percentage sort of comfort improvement that could be achieved by introducing different shade measures. So this is the sort of aerial view of the housing estate. And we introduced additional trees, a freestanding shade structure, and shade canopies around the community centre at ground level. And this is kind of what it looked like. Sort of on the left is what it kind of currently looks like. So lots of purple in the 2020s on a hot day. Not very comfortable for people moving between the blocks. They are undergoing a major redevelopment. And so the grey blocks on the right show the positive impact on comfort that the new development would have. And then we looked at additional measures, such as the 3 that I talked about: additional trees, a freestanding shade structure, and a shade canopy around the community centre. And you can see the purple went from red to more orangey yellow because of those shade measures being implemented. And then if you look into the future even further, what this shows is that shade alone is not sufficient to achieve comfortable conditions in the public realm in central London. And this is where other practical things need to be considered, such as cool surfaces, additional water features, amongst others. And this is just a visualization of what some of those measures that we modeled look like, or could look like. So a lot of our work takes place in London, because London's the biggest, hottest, most densely sort of urbanized city in the UK. And there is some really good work going on at the Greater London Authority city region level. A key piece of work that is informing a lot of other projects currently has been the London Climate Resilience Review. And we've undergone practical exercises looking at what would happen if we had another 40-degree summer or something even worse, and how everyone would respond, and how the interdependencies between all the stakeholders affected in a heat wave in London, how they would kind of work together to prevent all of those excess deaths that we had in 2022. We're working on a cooling roadmap for London for the Greater London Authority, looking at how cooling energy demand might increase, particularly in certain sectors where vulnerable people live or work or are cared for. And we're looking at categorizing those actions in kind of meaningful ways for the sort of various stakeholders involved. Another piece of work we're doing is a more community engagement project, working with the voluntary community and faith sectors in London. They often have unique insights into how heat affects people on the ground. And they also have a lot of assets in the form of buildings, sort of social capital, networks that we can really utilize and enhance to increase heat health and heat resilience in London. And here's an image from a workshop that we held at City Hall a couple of weeks back. And then zooming out of London to the global level again, this webinar is incredibly timely, because in Brazil at the moment, I think all the sort of major global cities, the mayors of those cities have just finished talking about what they're all doing to tackle climate change, and particularly what they're doing to tackle extreme heat. The C40 has just launched its Cool Cities Accelerator, which is really worth a look at. London is one of the cities that has signed up to that accelerator. And the Cool Coalition has a Beat the Heat implementation drive, which people can sign up for and kind of register their interest in contributing to. And I'm proud to say that Shade UK have recently signed up this week. And I suppose the takeaways of my presentation are that, you know, we need to plan in a way that integrates more shade in our built environment. And in London, we have the London Plan, our strategic planning document. And within that, there is a great policy called the cooling hierarchy. And this is all about how you keep indoor spaces comfortable in a kind of energy efficient and resource efficient way. And at the top of this list, surprise, surprise, is limiting unwanted solar gains, which is essentially shade. And at the bottom, unlike Houston, active cooling, i.e. air conditioning, is almost like the last port of call once you've tried everything else within your toolbox to keep your new development as comfortable and energy efficient as possible. And you achieve the greatest good for the greatest number if you work your way down this hierarchy, and everything else beneath the top levels becomes more effective if you do them in this order. And we're not, saying we don't need active cooling or air conditioning. I think we need the right kind in the right spaces for the people who need it most when they need it most. And based on the Hoban work that I talked about briefly before, our thermal comfort design hierarchy sort of complements that indoor space cooling hierarchy. And if you do things in this order in the public realm, you will also achieve the greatest good for the greatest number in terms of thermal comfort and heat health. So shade it, cool it, and then move it. And finally, we're all really enjoying this book in the Shade UK team at the moment. It's so good. I'd really recommend it. anything that I've mentioned here today, this book just really brings the reasons why we're all working on this topic in our own kind of regions of the world, in the climates that we find ourselves in. But it's a US focus, but has great relevance for all countries and all cities around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Polly, for your talk. That was really, really good. So we've got the perspective from the UK as well. And I think it was pretty insightful to see all the work Shade UK is doing. Especially also I found it quite interesting, the Holborn livable neighborhood and all the measures which you talked us through. I think that's really valuable, and to see what work can be done in the UK context as well. Thank you very much for that. I'm just conscious of time, and I'm straight away heading over to our next speaker, which is Siddharth Nadkarni. He is an urban planner and architect with over 15 years of experience helping cities in the Global South integrate resilience, sustainability, inclusion into urban and infrastructure planning. So Associate Director at Atkins Realis, he leads on delivering urban strategies, climate action plans, and capacity building projects for development organizations. His work spans regions facing severe heat risks, and he recently led the World Bank's Handbook on Urban Heat Management in the Global South, guiding cities on assessing and addressing heat impacts. Over to you, Siddharth. Thanks.
Thank you, Philip, and hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. So I'm going to speak about the Handbook for Urban Heat Management. This is a project that Atkins Realis led the development of, along with our partner, the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. We did this for the World Bank as part of a wider initiative that the World Bank's partnered with UN Habitat and UNEP on combating extreme heat in cities. So I think we all know that heat is already a major challenge. I think in the Global South, because of the impacts of climate change, if extreme heat is already not one of the most critical challenges in a city, it will soon be one. And the World Bank, in its engagement with city governments in South Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, was finding that there is a lot of awareness of the impacts of heat on residents in the city, on infrastructure, on the economy. But at the same time, city governments were not able to necessarily act to combat heat in their cities as effectively as they would like. And the reasons for that, some of these are very consistent across cities in the Global South, and some a bit more specific to the challenge of heat itself. The major challenge that a lot of cities mentioned was around dealing with the complexity of the topic. If you're talking about addressing heat, you're looking at how do you tackle a heat wave? How do you respond to a heat wave, which is something that a city government's emergency response department or disaster risk department would probably deal with. At the same time, you're looking at how do you build long-term resilience to heat in your city, which is probably something a different part of city government, probably the planning department would probably deal with. So if you're taking something that needs this multi-sectoral approach, and there's no natural home in city government for it, how do you even start addressing it? The second challenge a lot of cities mentioned was around the scale of action. When you're combating extreme heat, you're looking at actions at the individual scale, at the household scale, at the neighborhood scale, at the urban scale, and just that kind of range of scales ended up being a key challenge for cities to take any action. And finally, this is the one that's a consistent challenge across many cities in the Global South, which is capacity constraints. Most cities didn't have the technical capacity to grapple with a new challenge on top of their existing kind of scope of services. There are resource challenges. It reminds me of a city in East Africa with 500,000 people where a planning department consists of a chief planner and two administrative assistants. And then there are, of course, severe financial challenges. Cities don't have the ability to invest in actions to tackle heat very effectively. And so the need for some guidance for cities in the global south to take action on heat, not just create awareness, but also maybe implement infrastructure interventions or policy interventions that can adequately address the challenge, came up as a key gap, and that's what the World Bank commissioned us for to develop. So the handbook was developed by a team of about 15 people comprising of climate scientists and urban planners, architects, graphic designers, public health specialists. We had all worked with cities directly in developing heat action plans or developing urban strategies. And so there was a sense of what type of guidance might be valuable to include in this handbook. We also validated our kind of initial draft of a brief that's kind of up on screen at the moment, through consultations with potential users and practitioners in the regions that the handbook was supposed to address. And broadly, what a lot of city government staff, decision makers, practitioners were telling us what they wanted from a handbook was, number one, it had to be useful and user friendly. It had to enable action. So anything that is step-by-step guidance, anything that can help them act quickly, act effectively, act in an inclusive manner, would be useful in a handbook. It had to provide a holistic view of heat management. So move beyond managing heat waves, which a lot of cities were already doing, and help them build long-term resilience to heat. The handbook had to be focused on local governments staff in the global south as the primary audience, because we wanted it to encourage action, and who better to target guidance to than the people in the middle of taking action. This is a very broad set of regions we're covering with the handbook, so we had to give enough room in there for cities to adapt the guidance to their own context. At the same time, there are some common issues that cities were raising as part of what they wanted to see in the handbook. How do you address informality, which is a consistent issue, a cross-cutting issue across many parts of the global south. And at the same time, we're also looking at addressing some gaps in technical capacity. So it had to also account for not just planning for heat and responding to heat, but also other aspects of a planning process that aren't directly related to heat. So there's three different ways we kind of tackled this brief, which at times looks really long, and at times looks kind of contradictory, self-contradictory in some sense. So the first year, we kind of try to address this challenge of how do we target guidance to different types of users is by splitting the handbook into 3 volumes. The first one is a concise summary for city decision makers. It just gives an overview of the process, just enough for someone to maybe repeat in an elevator pitch. The second volume, and this forms the meat of the handbook. This is a technical manual for city government staff, and it gives the kind of detailed step-by-step guidance that they need in order to plan or respond to heat. And finally, there's a third volume, which is a solutions catalog. This contains solutions based on case studies that we encountered during our research going into the handbook. These were translated into essentially actions that cities could reference when they're thinking about what they could do to address the challenge of heat. Within the technical manual, there's another kind of structuring kind of solution to help organize some of this guidance. There are 4 sections in the technical manual. The first one's about understanding heat resilience. The purpose of that section is more to help city government staff communicate about heat to communities, to other departments within city government, to decision makers, So not only does it explain some key concepts and so on, but it also gives these talking points that could be useful when you're trying to make a case for why this should be taken seriously. The next two sections are about assessing and planning for heat. Both include step-by-step guidance. It takes somebody through every single step that's required to assess for heat risk and to plan for heat resilience. And the fourth section was about responding to heat waves. And we thought here the guidance has to kind of align itself to the urgency in which maybe that guidance is read. So if you're, say, 2 weeks away from a heat wave, you don't want to probably go through a very lengthy step-by-step manual, but something like a checklist might be more useful. So, if you're 2 weeks away from a heat wave, have you considered A, B, C, D? If you're in the midst of a heat wave, have you considered X, Y, Z, and so on? And then at the third tier in which we're trying to kind of organize this guidance deals with helping cities contextualize the guidance to their own context. So for most technical activities in the handbook, we've given multiple options based on level of effort, different approaches that help you get to the same outcome with lower or higher levels of confidence, but also lower or higher levels of effort. This also helps a lot of cities address capacity challenges. If you are able to, for example, get a relatively reliable understanding of heat hotspots through a workshop, that's better than nothing. And eventually, we want cities to take that option if they can't do something that's very time consuming or very effort intensive. A lot of the activities come with considerations. They're more like watch-its or tips and tricks for cities to adapt the guidance to their own context. Of course, there's the step-by-step guidance itself, which forms the meat of most of the technical manual, which is often supported by these sidebars that help city governments not necessarily address heat directly, but there are other activities that are maybe related to a planning process that might be useful to give some guidance on to finish this process effectively. And then for the solutions itself, we've got basic information that cities can use to basically triage solutions, identify which ones might be relevant to them, supported with this very detailed step-by-step guide on how to implement that solution if that's of interest. So that was how the guidance was structured, and now on to how it was developed. Of course, we had a team that had collectively more than 100 years of experience working with cities on similar topics. So that was our first port of call to understand how the guidance could be written, what it should focus on, and so on. The World Bank and UN Habitat and UNEP organized some quality enhancement reviews where they invited academics, professionals to kind of validate our work, give some suggestions on how it could be made more technically rigorous. Of course, there's quite a lot of literature out there on how to plan for heat resilience, how to respond to heat waves. So that was a key source for how the guidance came together. And finally, a lot of the guidance was co-created with city government staff, practitioners, academics in the regions where this handbook was supposed to be used. With those consultations, I think eventually reached close to 200 people whose contributions feature in the handbook. We've kind of did these sessions in 5 different countries through different modes, through workshops, focus groups, key informant interviews. It was all of these consultation sessions were, of course, great to get data, great to validate what we think works. So we tried different modes of testing the guidance. We had workshops where we would give people a hypothetical case and a section of the handbook to resolve the case in some sense. Through the consultation, the other thing that stood out is some consistent patterns that kept coming up. that acted as barriers for cities to take action on heat. And as a through line running through the handbook, we distill these down into these 5 principles that you see up on your screen now. The first one is start now. If needed, start small. The second one is about taking action in a collaborative manner. The third one is to give some certainty when you're planning for heat resilience, or for planning interventions of any kind, to provide it some kind of institutional certainty, some kind of financial certainty. The fourth principle is to look for ways in which heat as a topic can be tailored to your city. Often that means it's a co-benefit of doing something else. Sometimes it's the most important thing you want to press through an intervention. And then the last principle is building on what has worked well in the past. For each of these principles, what also came out quite often through our consultations was how many cities were already taking action that already aligned itself to these principles. And some of those are featured in the handbook as well. So for the first principle, there's this great example from the city of Nepalganj, which is on the border with India. Some very similar challenges that a city of that size has in terms of capacity. And they started their heat resilience journey with what looked like a very small workshop to do a qualitative assessment of what seemed to be neighborhoods in the city most affected by heat. There were some development organizations participating in the workshop who got interested. The scale of the assessment became more complex. You suddenly had additional resources to do something at that complexity or that scale. And one thing led to another, and they now have a heat action plan that serves as almost as a model for other cities in Nepal. And it all starts with this one small workshop. The second one is an example from Cape Town that effectively piggybacked the implementation of their heat action plan to an existing institutional structure for taking action on climate adaptation. What that meant is you had a ready-made institutional mechanism to implement actions. You had access to a long-term source for funding and more certainty, which has led to some interesting interventions like the screenshot of a tool that helps communities and households to kind of plan for heat waves and take action for it. And the third great example is from Medellin in Colombia, where there was this idea of a project that could connect neighborhoods. The main purpose was to address some socioeconomic challenges. But the city quite wisely decided to overlay addressing extreme heat and air pollution on top of those corridors to kind of create these green corridors, which, within 3 years of implementing large parts of it is already resulting in quite a significant reduction in average temperatures in the city. That's a bit of a teaser of the handbook. There's a QR code that you can scan and download the handbook. And yeah, look forward to any questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siddharth. That was really helpful to have a bit of an idea how the handbook looks like and what it addresses, basically. And I think it's also good to see that, as you mentioned, many cities and towns, they're already on their journey, basically, to implement strategies and activities to combat heat and to deal with it. Please put in your questions in the Q&A box. That would be really helpful. Keep doing that. And we, as I'm mindful of time, we're now heading over to our last speaker, who is Omeir Awad. Hopefully I pronounced that more or less correctly. Sorry, Omeir. Omeir is a sustainability consultant with over 16 years of experience in the built environment, currently serving as an associate director with Bureau Hapold's advisory team. He supports the construction value chain in achieving sustainability goals through strategic frameworks and implementation roadmaps with deep expertise in the Middle East and North African sustainability regulations and international planning. He advises on outdoor thermal comfort, urban heat islands, and climate resilience. Over to you, Omar. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Hi, everyone. Yeah, starting from the picture, just to probably set the tone, and probably you can imagine the region is quite different than maybe the UK or Europe that were already addressed from previous speaker, or even the Asia aspects. But really, it's a matter of I think what we're trying to address here in this presentation, we're talking about the MENA challenges and what kind of impacts are already been seen based on heat and climate change, and then also addressing what kind of frameworks that are being followed in the region to address these challenges and risks. And at the end, providing example of existing policies, tools, and design strategies that are being considered for the region. Really just to show sort of the magnitude of the issue and why it is quite critical in the region to consider climate change and really to tackle the issue, and focusing on the heat specifically, because we know the region is a quite critical in terms of how climate change is impacting it quite faster than the other areas, other countries. The temperature are being increasing quite faster than the global average in the region, and is expected to increase by more than 6 degrees Celsius if these issues are not tackled. Also, we've already got temperature raises and exceeding the 50 degrees Celsius in summer days in UAE, and also in Saudi Arabia, and similarly in the Gulf region. And that's all impacting the environment and impacting the nature and the agriculture. And we've seen, and because of that, and because of the impacts of the heat and the climate change, the land is already degrading more than it was before. There's already proven evidence of that. There's also all of that also creating sort of a cycle and a domino effect that is making it even worse, not only at the environment, also at the economic of the cities, and there are already kind of studies showing how severe these stresses and risks will actually become. And by 2050, for example, there would be a loss in the economy values around 23 billion in the region. So it's really now showing how these are directly impacting the people, impacting the assets, impacting the economy, but also impacting the ecosystem. So it's expected by 2050 that more than 50% of the days in the year are going to be more heat days, and with a very kind of exceeding the 40 degrees Celsius in the region. And that's also putting a stress on the physical assets, increasing the issues on safety, on health, and also on stability and the elderlies as well. And that's also impacting the nature, where we see the impact on the mangroves in the region, and the marine ecosystem is being degraded, and that's impacting the fish stock, the food, and the food value chain, and also impacting the marine ecosystem. And as a result, all of these issues will continue to put more pressure on the economy, specifically focusing on the construction, on the tourism, on the real estate, and that will be as a result of reducing the interest and by investors, or even the people who live here will be less excited, and that's also increasing the operational costs of the assets and the cities that we're building in the region, and we will continue to do so. So we know that cities will continue to grow, and specifically in the MENA region, there's massive plans to expand in the cities that are existing, and continue to build more for the people who live here and for the citizens of the countries. And we see, I mean, the key kind of 5 factors we're kind of witnessing as a result of expanding the cities is basically because of the transformation of the areas and the surfaces in the city from a nature or from nature covers becoming more of like a concrete and asphalt areas. And the urban fabric as well, because all of the surfaces of the buildings are trapping the heat and raising the temperatures. The materials are being used, also absorbing the heat and releasing it to the environment at the different times of the day and the year. And also that kind of design of the urban fabric and the density and restricting airflows and the heat retention is a key factor, in addition to the human activities, of course, that will keep to increase and will keep to escalate the issue, impacting the heat and the urban heat island impact. And see on the right side, there's an image of Riyadh and how the city, based on the density, it's very evident the increase of temperature, and the urban heat island intensity is clearly visible, that it can cause up to 4 degrees Celsius compared to the rural areas in the same city. And not only that, because we know the issue is not a standalone issue. So there's all the kind of the relationship between the climate, but also the health, and how the climate and the climate change and the heat conditions are impacting the health. And the example giving for COVID, but also there are the non-communicable diseases, which are the kind of the key element of death around the globe. And that's somehow directly related to the temperatures and the air quality and the physical activities that we do. And that's, I mean, as a result, the economical impact. So we see here kind of an example of the domino effect and how, temperatures and getting the air quality and all of the other climate-related issues are impacting humans, impacting communities, and as a result, the cities and the economies. And based on that, in the region, there has been a push further, and there has been kind of an interest seen in the region because of the urban heat island issue, but also the heat waves and the very harsh climate conditions in the region. So we've seen a lot of issues with flash floods, with heat storms and sandstorms that comes in a very strong but also very short durations that might create a severe and a longer impact that keeps on stressing the cities and the infrastructure within the city for a longer duration. So there's been kind of an exploration of what can be done in terms of the immediate risks and stresses versus what can be done at the longer term and a more of addressing the issue from a resilient perspective. So now there are multiple kind of angles to look at it in terms of how the cities are prepared for immediate stresses versus being prepared for a long-term kind of expected and projected climate-related issues or heat stresses. And that's also applies to across the 5 elements here we've looked at in terms of flexibility, how the policies and the infrastructure can actually be tweaked and changed quickly to address these issues, whether it's through the infrastructure, like changing certain areas from a use, such as car park areas or open spaces or green spaces, into water retention areas and human aid areas in certain time of the year. The speed of responses as well, another aspect we've looked at, the adaptability and the recovery time across resiliency and agility. And now, really, we've also kind of looked at what kind of the key resilience and planning considerations that needs to be while we're thinking of a city resilience or a district level or a building level. So the scale is very important, and putting that into context across the surroundings, and what could be the transboundary kind of effect, because the issues can be also transferred and transmitted from neighboring areas. Also looking at the sectors, what is within the boundary, what is in the surrounding, and how the context can help each other, instead of looking at each area or a city individually. The geographical conditions, in terms of is it a coastal area, is it a rural area, is it a dense area, is it a more of a low-rise building. So all of these kind of considerations will have a different measures and different aspects to look at. And what kind of hazard? Of course, here we're talking about heat and heat waves and urban heat island overall. And at the end, also the stakeholders and how we can also address the local communities and the governments and all of the ecosystem around it. To do that, we need to start with understanding the climate risks, the climate hazards, and then what's the exposure and the sensitivity of the infrastructure and the people across different climate risks and hazards, and then what is already there in place in terms of the adaptive capacity. What do we have as a measures in place, and then that will somehow get the equation out, how vulnerable and how prepared are we at a city level or at a master plan level or at a district level to these issues and criteria. And that's where also we kind of came with a theory of change kind of principle, where climate change is directly related to the ecosystem and impacting the ecosystem, and that's by itself also impacting the human activities. And if there's enough adaptation measures, then risks will keep to escalate, and as well as the mitigation measures will need to be in place to reduce the climate change impact as an action by human activities. And to look at that from the sort of the whole context of the city, and mainly looking at what governments and what policies are in place addressing the issue, and then basically what can we do as designers and as planners to address the issues collectively, right? So there would be interventions and initiatives taken at a city level, but then there's also a need for every developer to kind of develop and design and these considerations. So looking at the sort of the policies in place and what strategies, we looked at the context of Riyadh, and in Dubai there's the Green Riyadh kind of framework that looks at planting and tree planting and improving the vegetation across the whole city. And in tandem with that, there's the irrigation policy, sustainable irrigation policy, to make sure that we're also not overstressing the resources in the city. and then the kind of the legislative element and the community engagement as a third policy in place to address the issue. And there are kind of multiple strategies coming out of this, including the heat risk assessment, reflective materials, smart irrigation, and these, in addition to the active measures such as the district cooling systems and the like. Similarly, in Dubai, I think there's the Dubai 2040 plan. So there are the zoning and planning overlay policy together with the green corridor policy, so that whenever we plan and design a new master plan within the city, we need to consider what kind of ecological corridors that needs to be maintained, what kind of zoning buffers and overlays that has to be considered to support the whole city principles. And moving from that into a specific examples for master plans and designers that designing within Dubai, what can they take into consideration to support the governmental initiatives and tackle the urban heat island and the heat stresses issues. So the example of upgrading building surfaces and the building fabrics and integrating vegetation and green facades as part of the whole city urban fabric. Of course, there should be a consideration of the irrigation required for that, and using the local and native species as part of the planting and the urban greening. That is very critical, so that we don't also forget the resource conservation. And that's, as a result, also support the outdoor thermal comfort and livability within the city. And the other kind of solutions we've looked at is cool spots. So that I think we've mentioned about the hotspot before, my colleagues mentioned about it. So really, we based on kind of the heat maps and what can be integrated as part of the master plan in terms of cool spots and improving certain shading practices, increasing the trees, and making sure that the designs are kind of maintaining a comfort level at a good stage. And the last slide here is really a case study that focusing on testing different scenarios and how we could reduce the outdoor temperatures by more than 10 degrees Celsius by using a series of interventions, and that's including the paving, having the light color paving and with the high SRI index, introducing the shading in certain areas and prioritizing the shading places where people are actually moving and sitting and socializing. In addition to that, the green fabric that was shown as a very effective measure in terms of reducing the surface's temperature and the outdoor thermal temperature, as well as supporting the livability and the people's satisfaction within the community. And that's it from my side. Probably I was a bit late, and apologies for that.
No, not to worry though. Thank you very much, Romain, for your presentation. That was really helpful, and also brought us a bit, again, a different perspective and into a different region. And I think what you mentioned at the beginning, it's quite almost shocking, you could say, in terms of temperatures and predicted temperature rises, isn't it? And we urgently need to do something about that, and probably more about that. And it's really good that lots of cities and regions are taking action, and I think, and that there are so many initiatives at this stage. So can I invite now all our speakers to join us again? That would be really good for our questions and answer sessions. I already had a look at the Q&A box, and I noticed that there was lots going on there already, lots of questions and lots of answers from our speakers, so that's really good. So that is helpful. Please keep on asking questions. We try to answer as many as we can. We still got a few unanswered questions in our Q&A box, so maybe we can have a look at those. That would be good. For example, there was another question from Wendy Haig in terms of, has there been any research on protecting water assets, for example, reservoirs, ponds, streams, to reduce water loss during the intense heat and reduce the potential for mosquitoes to breed in stagnant water? So again, that would be a question in terms of one of the measures to combat heat as well. Who wants to answer that? Any one of you, Siddharth or Umair, do you want to answer to that, or?
Maybe I can take a shot at this. I'm not aware of any research, but when we do strategic action planning, there's often many actions, many interventions that have multiple co-benefits. Recently, there was an urban action plan where one of the actions was installing solar panels over canals to kind of reduce evaporation. And you of course get space to put solar panels, which is a much better way to generate energy for farms and so on, but also like helps you save water and reduce evaporation. So there are initiatives like that I'm aware of, but I'm not necessarily aware of any research on that specifically.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Stephanie, Mayor Polly, do you have any, or are you aware of any examples of that?
I'm not super aware of it. I think also in Houston, like water loss after heat is not really one of our main concerns, because we have, if anything, more water than we need. But I mean, I do know of some out in California. There's a man-made lake that is evaporating and becoming hypersaline. And one of the issues there is more the kind of the air pollution from the dust that's coming off the playa or the lake bed, as an example. So I know there's research on some of those water assets, like as things are evaporating and how that changes how people use that. That's also out in a desert climate where it's a big flyover for migrating birds. But that's one specific example. A lot of the water issues we have kind of water pollution, cleaning water. We do have some of that solar on water sources. Actually, there's a big push for floating solar on detention ponds in the Houston area. But yeah, it's kind of broadly, I don't have a huge picture of the in terms of water loss during intense heat.
Yeah. Umair, do you have examples from, for example, Dubai or Riyadh? Have they done anything in terms of, irrigation or canals or water ponds or water features in their strategies?
So yeah, I think on a kind of a district level, we kind of be careful in terms of recommending water features, because there's also in addition, the evaporation, of course, is an issue, and the humidity is also an issue already in the region. So it has to be very carefully treated, and in addition to that, I think we've seen outdoor areas also introducing sort of active measures. So not only the water bodies, but also adding sort of fans or outdoor conditioning, so that they can also support in certain days of the year people that can use these outdoor spaces. But again, I think it's not been kind of proven as a great example, especially with the harsh conditions. I mean, it will be, I think, the focus will be probably at a certain days of the year, and you have to be really careful with the analysis and the study, to that when you recommend that within certain areas or certain days of the year that can be used, and that will also needs to be managed with the people expectations, right? Because when you're sitting outdoors with certain climate conditions, you're not expected to be as comfortable as you're sitting indoors. So that's, I think, another key aspect needs to be communicated and considered.
Yeah, of course. There was another question from Colin Holm in terms of water. The smart irrigation you mentioned must be crucial in arid cities. Are there transferable methods that temperate countries like parts of UK that are water stressed could adopt? Is that for Polly or Omar, probably, to answer?
Hi, I mean, I don't have direct project experience in the sort of arid and extreme heat of the Middle East and some of the places that Omar is more familiar with.
Yeah.
But certainly the link between keeping green infrastructure irrigated to keep it green and to provide that evapotranspiration is key. And I think, you know, Stephanie will know the sort of ins and outs of that, I'm sure. I think it links also to Tom's question about, certainly in the UK, where we have both hot and dry weather and wet and cold weather, and we experience the floods when it's, you know, heavy rain and it's winter, and we experience the heat waves and the droughts in the summer. How can we like design sustainable drainage systems that capture that excess rainfall to then use that as kind of irrigation or a source of water to keep the green stuff green when we need it to be in the summer? So I think sustainable drainage systems, certainly in London, lots of local authorities in London are very literate in how you calculate and install, you know, little kind of pocket rain gardens and sustainable drainage kind of you know, features in the kind of public realm. But I think we should try and link that now to shade giving and cooling features, so they're kind of symbiotic.
Yeah, very good idea.
I think probably from the region, when we talk about irrigation and drainage, I think the measure is about the considerations basically in terms of smart monitoring and controlling, so that the irrigation does not happen in a certain day of the day, a certain time of the day, and it, where, you know, the temperatures are not at the max, and then the water retention can be even better within the soil, and then also having these sensors in terms of when the plants would need the water, instead of watering it, you know, just at the regardless of what time of the day. So that's kind of measuring how the soil conditions are and what kind of the water content within. So I think that's kind of the practices going on in here, to ensure that, you know, plants are healthy and also the water demand is also managed correctly.
Yeah. As you pointed out, Polly, Tom Walsh had questions in terms of, I think, the guidance. He was asking, for many years, planners have had guidance on flooding, flood maps, assessment tools, and retention requirements. How do we get to a point where we have the same evidence base and guidance when it comes to heat? And I think, yeah, that is a question, isn't it, to us all? I mean, I think there are many things out there already. But the question is in terms of, probably here in the UK, thinking about more, well, guidance, but then also regulations and things like that. And I think probably it's quite different from country to country. Anyone to respond to that?
I can speak to some of the US side. This has been a conversation that's been happening the past couple of years, that it's very variable and not agreed upon where heat kind of sits in government choices. So like, especially, is it under emergency management the way that other climate extremes are? In most cases, no. Does it fit under resilience? Like there's people don't really agree where it's supposed to sit. And so it's very hard to address those issues well, like not knowing who it really falls under. Like for the most part, it falls under public health in Houston, Harris County. But then in an emergency event, how do they adapt with the Office of Emergency Management? And Texas is, because of the way our government is set up, a lot of things are very siloed. Everybody wants to have their own office, which further complicates that if you don't know where something sits.
Yeah, doesn't sound very helpful then, does it?
It's definitely a challenge.
Any more comments or responses on that?
I mean, I would say the picture that Stephanie has just painted, I think is recognizable here in the UK. You know, we're kind of more comfortable with flood risk as a climate risk. And therefore, I think our experience of flooding and then the planning policies, guidance, you know, technical guidance that is then used to sort of respond to that risk is more mature and is more focused. You know, people know what you need to do, even, you know, if it costs money and it's tricky to do, people roughly know what we need to do. I think with heat, we've got a long way to go and we need to do it very quickly to kind of catch up with where we are with flood risk. That would be my opinion. But, you know, I think the evidence is there. It's just kind of, I think the more we can make practical interventions and deploy, you know, real things in the built environment that make it more comfortable and safer and more resilient to heat, people become more familiar with it. And it will be like a positive, virtuous kind of cycle.
Thank you. There was another comment from Colin Holm, I think it was. He appreciated the talks on urban heat islands that makes heat in the cities even more worse. But he says, but don't forget rural communities too, particularly coincidence of aging populations and non-resilient housing. Does anyone want to answer to that?
Yeah, one of the things that is important there is the limited access to resources. Like there's definitely a challenge getting to cooling centers, even within the Houston area. But then in a rural area, you might have one cooling center that is not easy to get to. And I think also, you know, we see a lot of this in Texas is these places that have been rural are now rapidly urbanizing. And so not only is the heat increasing with climate change, but there's also all this active heat and development consequences that are adding to that. And it is really shifting how people have been comfortably living, shifting costs of living, those kind of things that make it a unique challenge. And there's oftentimes fewer resources that they have access to or are aware of because it's such a new issue.
Yeah. Siddharth or Maya, anything to add?
I could jump in or have a go. You know, I think the distribution of the urban heat island effect that Stephanie showed in her diagram, I think what that shows, it's not quite as binary as like urban heat risk versus, you know, there's no heat risk in rural areas, because heat exposure factors and heat vulnerability factors are many and they interplay in different ways. So, for example, social isolation or living in a home that wasn't very well insulated or shaded could be a huge risk factor for a person living in a rural community. Whereas you could have a very kind of well-insulated, tree canopy rich neighborhood in central London, and the vulnerability is much lower. So I think we do need to kind of think about these nuances, and it's not just urban heat risk, but I think cities are generally hotter and there's more people at risk, but you still have heat risk in rural communities and properties and high streets too.
All right, thank you. Last question from Nicole Yu. Please advise if there is any resilience rating or index that we can monitor adaptation and mitigation measures are effective or efficient. Siddharth or Maya, are you aware of anything like that?
I mean, I think there's quite a few assessments on the mitigation side, because you can definitely quantify impacts in a more focused way. The challenge with adaptation interventions is how do you quantify in a way that kind of like encapsulates all of its impacts and core benefits. And I think it's almost an inherent challenge with any kind of adaptation intervention. And when we're trying to make a case for city governments or decision makers to kind of think about investing in adaptation investments, we're usually often relying on talking about the qualitative kind of benefits of some of these. And in urban context, talking about improvements in quality of life. If, for example, you're talking about green public space interventions for that are primarily helping you combat heat, perhaps, but actually is great to have another additional open space in the city, and so on. So yeah, I think it's just a challenge with adaptation in general. That just it ends up becoming very hard to communicate quantitatively, which may not be such a bad thing. That sometimes the qualitative benefits help you tell a stronger story or a more tangible story to someone who may not understand the numbers of it very well.
Yeah, thank you. Omair, did you want to answer?
No, I think I just to add probably to what Sid is saying is a matter like to quantify in a way because the risk is there, right? And then the impact is visible. But then how do we quantify the reduction of that impact on whether it's on the environment, whether it's on people, or whether it's on the infrastructure? And then taking sort of what baseline is there, and then, but I'm not 100% aware of what kind of a specific index or a global, because I would imagine that also a region specific or a context specific that might not be a global index that can be used.
Okay, thank you. I'm mindful of time. It's already 4:30 on my clock, so 90 minutes have passed already. It has gone quite quickly, I have to say. Hopefully you enjoyed this session as well. All of you who attended and listened to our speakers who gave really insightful presentations, I think, today, especially about the risks of urban heat to humans, to the environment and the economy as well. I think every speaker has presented quite helpful and useful solutions specific to their areas, cities and regions. And I think progress is already there and visible I think, in many parts, in many cities and regions. And I think that's quite hopeful, even though the challenge is quite a big one in the future. So thank you again, Stephanie, Polly, Siddharth, and Umair for your talks. I believe our attendees are delighted what they have heard. It just leaves me with a few closing remarks. Please go to get involved and go on X to follow us on @RTPI Yorks and tell us what you think. Please also complete the RTPI survey that will appear once this webinar finishes. And then after this session, we'll provide you with a link to the recorded webinar. For details of upcoming webinars and events for the rest of 2025, please visit rtpi.org.uk/events. Again, thank you very much to all of our speakers for their great talks, for the conversations, for responding to many questions. And thank you very much for attending this session today. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Thank you very much and happy World Town Planning Day. Cheers, guys. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.